Hello and welcome to The Wire. So scholar, author, historian, Yale Professor of History and Global Affairs, Professor David Engerman. Welcome to The Wire and to Bookshook. It's a pleasure to host you.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So it's a really fascinating kind of arc of personality, global headwinds at the time, history, economic theory, economic reality that you've put in your book, Apostles of Development, 6 Economists and the World They Made, that we're here to discuss today. Why write that now?
Why write that book now? Well, now 2025 seems especially relevant given the existential crisis of USAID and then the kind of broader rolling crisis in the Western world in general about aid. But when I started with, I guess, an intellectual question, which is what would a history of international development look like if it didn't start at the World Bank, if it didn't start in Washington or New York or London or Bonn or Paris, but started in the Global South. I had just finished a book on India's economic Cold War, and so was particularly attracted to this, to writing about South Asia. And then a colleague pointed out to me that some of the figures I'd been looking at as I was trying to sort out the topic had all studied together at Cambridge. And when I looked, I actually found 6 really remarkable economists who all were at Cambridge between, say, 1953 and 1957. And they had both varied and illustrious careers that allowed me to tell a quite broad global history from the perspective of South Asian economists.
Yeah. So there is this kind of dominant narrative that development economics is a first world idea which was given, if you like, to the global majority. But your book really kind of challenges that, and you speak of figures like Amartya Sen and Manmohan Singh, almost architects of development theory, and Mahbub, the father of the Human Development Index, if you like. So how important is this for Indians to say, or people of South Asia to absorb and understand? And do you think that even people in the global majority get this?
I can't speak to how much they get it. I guess I could speak to how much they should. And I hope that this is a book that everyone in South Asia will learn something from. Obviously, people have profound, deep expertise in these topics. But I was able to look at this. I was able to look at this from a perspective and follow them over their long careers, including into archives ranging from Sri Lanka to Helsinki, and hopefully offer something to it. One of the things I think it will offer South Asians in general is what was going on in their neighbors. And I think this is relevant for Indians to understand the Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Sri Lankan situation over many decades, and ceteris paribus for all the other for elsewhere in South Asia.
Ceteris paribus. No, it's really
spoken like an economist.
Spoken like a true economist. But it's really like good that you've done this, because a lot of facts also that were like well known, things like the per capita income of Britain being much higher than that of British India, but the fact that it was 11 times higher than what British India's was, and that it grew 2.5 times at the time they colonized India. So a lot of patterns just come out from the facts also that your book draws out. You describe how Manmohan Singh and Mahbub were kind of impacted by the partition so greatly. It was a time of great kind of trauma and displacement and disruption, economics-wise as well. How much do you think that disruption impacted their thinking of the world and their economics?
It's a good question. I think it was present, especially in Mahbub Haq's mind, in part because he actually married a Bengali woman, Khadija Haq, Khadija Khanum. And so the question of communal ties were always significant. What is surprising is they actually rarely wrote about that, and I would say it's true for most of these people I call the apostles, most of these economists, that they did not until much later in their careers turn their attention to sort of axes of non-economic inequality in their home countries.
And do you think it was because they were just so familiar with it that they'd rather leave that behind, or was that the impact of the Cambridge school?
I think it's not necessarily the impact of Cambridge directly, but the impact of being an economist and trained as an economist. So they did look at, for instance, the 1947 partition, which separated the jute fields from the jute factories, now across the national border. I think, but they tended toward, at least in their public identities and their public work, tended toward economic questions first and foremost. There are, of course, exceptions. They were prolific but I would say it was not at the center of the economic questions remained at the center of the work.
I come to Dr. Manmohan Singh because he's been such an important figure for India, and he's the one person who ends up as Prime Minister from these 6, which was like a huge, which you could not have predicted while he was at Cambridge. How should Indians evaluate his legacy? His economic legacy is very significant, but it's also contested. So is it about liberalizing and freeing up the Indian entrepreneurial soul, or is it also about fostering a degree of inequality and creating a different set of problems?
I mean, I think I would say, and this book reflects, that each crisis brings forth a solution, but that solution eventually builds a new crisis. I mean, the fundamental question about focusing on poverty, reducing poverty versus reducing inequality was something all 6 were attuned to. I think Dr. Singh was moving toward a kind of center ground in this, and I think he used the same logic that Mahbub al-Haq used. When Mahbub al-Haq was asked about pushing for redistribution, he says, well, we need to have growth first because you can't redistribute poverty. And so I think this is an element in their work. I think Amartya Sen actually summed up Dr. Singh's legacy or the tensions quite well when he said that it's great, this is after 1991, it's great that Dr. Singh and Narasimha Rao have gotten the government out of places it shouldn't be, but now let's see it get the government into places it should be. And it's possible to see that in UPA 1 and UPA 2, although again, always contested.
So even beyond Manmohan Singh, there is this bit in your book which is like just very well written about how, I'll just read from there a bit, where you speak of how this together the apostles, the succession of development ideas, fads even, disguise a slow and subtle convergence. While their Cambridge teachers often framed their debates purely in terms of states versus markets, their categories were less absolute than they first seemed. And with the exception of perhaps Jagdish Bhagwati, you see that kind of not framing it between state and markets, which is pretty much the paradigm that they were functioning in, and this long arc. Why do you think that kind of happened?
Well, I think Bhagwati's career is, you're right to say, different than this, although I was surprised to find some of his writings, both his academic and his writings, as well as his kind of commentaries on Indian economy in the late 1950s and early 1960s, to actually occupy this sort of middle ground. But I think he, as he gained fame outside the academy, he pushed more became a kind of a vigorous and vehement proponent of globalization, and tended not to see things in colors, but more black and white. And then this, of course, gets wrapped up in kind of ongoing tension with Amartya Sen, about which an Indian audience needs to hear. There's little to that I can add.
Yeah. So, so you're right. And maybe it was even the fact of their own circumstances and the countries they came from, that there was never a strict dichotomy between markets and the state, and the markets were seen, as you say, an allocative mechanism rather than some, it
was not a temple to worship to.
Exactly, yeah, I sort of evaded that. So there's also Mahbub al-Haq's kind of Human Development Index, and even Amartya Sen talks about how Mahbub al-Haq took a lot of help from him on the maths of it, because that was like not a strong point. So Amartya Sen helped him with all of that. You speak of how he was desperate to draw in Amartya Sen on that project of the HDI, and Amartya Sen was like a bit reluctant to do it. Do you want to tell our viewers a little bit?
So I think Professor Sen's reluctance is about losing kind of the subtlety for which his own work was especially known. And coming up with a single measure as something as complex as human development, which should account for human flourishing writ large, and even if one were to look at quantitative measures, how one might gather those. So I see Professor Sen's reluctance as a call. It's fitting with him staying primarily in an academic career, whereas Mahbub al-Haq really wanted to change things, and to change things you needed big, bold, simple, straightforward measures, and that's what they got.
Yeah, but isn't it kind of tragic and also a bit odd that you have Mahbub al-Haq, a Pakistani stellar kind of a voice, globally acknowledged, and yet HDI, I don't think Pakistan's doing very much about HDI or even framing its economics in any way that would kind of be a hat tip to the HDI. Why is that in his own country of origin, that had such little purchase?
Well, I mean, I would start by saying came as a surprise to me how younger Pakistanis see Mahbub al-Haq, and they focused less on his international efforts. He had this remarkable work at the World Bank in the 1970s, and of course human development when he was at the UN in the 1980s and 90s. And they see him more in the 60s and 80s when he was working for Ayub Khan, and I think this was especially unforgivable for young Pakistanis working for General Zia ul-Haq. And so I think some of it is wrapped up in there. I think Huck's design was that he would a simple index would foster competition, and people who were working with him closely said that he himself did that. The first thing he would look at when he saw a new human development report was Pakistan's position vis-a-vis India.
So yes, it's wrapped up in a lot.
Yeah, and then he and his wife, Khadija Haq, moved to Islamabad in the mid-90s and started a human development in South Asia project, which I think was a more direct effort to get to focus on Pakistani's situation.
Sri Lanka and Bangladesh seem to have a slightly different trajectory, stated aims, and sometimes some very interesting results. I mean, you're just coming from Colombo. The cities are much cleaner. There's a separate way in which they look at urban planning from the way maybe India and Pakistan have gone. So what explains that? And there's been a lot of controversy about if Bangladesh has gone past India's per capita income as well. So what explains Bangladesh and Sri Lanka having a different kind of a feel for how they view
well, I mean, Sri
progress?
Lanka has a very, very long tradition of social welfare spending. Food has been heavily subsidized, a healthcare system, primary schools, etc. So much so that Joan Robinson, the Apostles instructor at Cambridge, once said that Sri Lanka, actually Ceylon at that point, this was in 1959, Ceylon has tasted the fruit before planting the seed, that had been focusing on well-being even at a moment where it needed to focus on growth. But any effort, many governments fell on attempts to tinker with the food subsidy, and so I think that was just baked into Sri Lankan political economy, and I think that created a floor of subsistence that India has not yet achieved.
And Bangladesh, I mean, it's kind of veering away so dramatically from the Pakistan trajectory post coming into being. What explains that?
I mean, I think as with all of these, there's a degree of luck and a degree of effort. I think the markets were open enough in the 1990s in Bangladesh that there's a kind of sharp move toward producing ready-made garments. And this, of course, a version of this producing textiles had been a key to the growth of the Asian tigers in the 1950s and 60s. And this was a generation later was able to take advantage of that. The ready-made garments provided plentiful employment, especially for females, and that, combined with remittances from Bangladeshis working mostly in the Middle East, provided resources that really allowed this expansion. I should also note the government policy was oriented towards supporting ready-made garments as well. So it's a combination of market actors and government.
Really.
Yeah,
and
really
being willing to kind of capture that opportunity.
And having the luck to do it at the right time.
Yeah. You kind of also say that development wasn't just a Cold War phenomenon, but a genuine global South kind of project. So how does this reframing help us understand current debates about India's economic sovereignty or its relationship with institutions like the IMF and the World Bank?
I mean, I guess by reframing it, I want international development to be seen as a project that is of, by, and for the global South, the global majority. That it was the ideas, I think, come out of efforts to solve practical problems. It's not all up in the realm of high theory. It's really trying to solve problems that are in front of them. And I think that's built into development economics. And those problems were problems of poverty and inequality in the global South. What does that mean for today? I mean, some significant parts of our international financial governance are still show the signs of their birth in the 1940s, right? That there's never been a head of the World Bank who's not an American citizen. There's never been a head of IMF who's not a European citizen. We can call those places shareholder democracies, but those shares aren't for sale. So it's hard to, even as Indian economy has improved and has become, quite powerful, that's not necessarily fully reflected in the voting tallies. So I think these efforts to democratize the international financial system and international financial governance, something that all of the apostles at various moments worked toward, is still, I guess if I were optimistic, I would say still incomplete.
So, I should have done this at the start of the interview, but a quick detour into why you call them the apostles.
So it's an inside Cambridge joke, actually. So there's an organization, a literary society, founded in the early 19th century called the Conversazione Society. And at the time it was founded, it had only 12 members, and some, with typical schoolboy humor, I suppose, a Cambridge student nicknamed them the Apostles. The nickname is stuck. They now have more than 12 members, but it's stuck. And in the mid-20th century, actually, John Maynard Keynes, who had died before any of the Apostles came to Cambridge, but whose ideas still shaped a great deal of their experience there, was a member of the Apostles. Two of the six economists I write about were also members, and so I take that as an inside Cambridge joke, but I also think that in a way they were in fact apostles. They debated, formulated doctrine, and they disseminated doctrine, much as we would expect apostles to do.
Yeah, and do they like this name, apostles? Do they know that you're going to be calling this book the Apostles?
They do know. The only person who's commented directly to me about this was Rehman Sobhan, and he said, but how can we be apostles if who's Jesus, right? If we're the apostles, then who's Jesus?
Awesome. Would that be Joan Robinson? Maybe not, no.
Yeah.
Yeah, but they were all influenced by Joan Robinson.
They were all influenced by Joan Robinson, although the influences varied. And I don't want to give the impression that they came to Cambridge unformed and were shaped only by that. In fact, Professor Sen described his Cambridge education as a letdown after what he had at Presidency College in Calcutta.
Professor Sen say that. So the book also reveals kind of very sharp disagreements among these economists, and there are subtler disagreements, but a very fundamental line that I can see is between, say, Professor Bhagwati and the rest, when it comes to inequality, role of markets, etc. And which kind of path would you, as a historian, as somebody who's delved so deep into their times, into how they were framed, which path do you think has kind of won, if you like, at the end of the bout?
Well, this may be impolite, but I would actually say that Bhagwati was not alone on that side. I think Dr. Singh was always more inclined toward markets. I mean, his dissertation at Oxford, his first book, were about increasing foreign trade. Lal Jayawardane was also interested in trade, although in a sort of more moderate position, I suppose. So I do think that's a fundamental difference. But as a historian, I take my job to understand what they were reacting to and the impacts that it had.
No winners? You don't want to call out winners?
I can't. Well, I don't know if I'd say that here, but even if I felt them, we can't helicopter back to 1961 and rewrite India's third five-year plan or Pakistan's second five-year plan. I think one of the cases to be made for the Nehruvian model, although it also faced obviously severe limits, was building a base of infrastructure, public goods, roads, power supply, et cetera, that would have been necessary for any kind of market-oriented takeoff, because markets tend not to, private firms tend not to get involved in the infrastructure like that.
Would it have been interesting had a Chinese kind of also been in this, with the seventh apostle? Do you have any characters who came close to that?
No, I mean, Cambridge in the 1950s was not a particularly cosmopolitan place. From looking at the names, I don't know that I recall any Chinese names in the roster of economics students while they were there. I mean, I think China is, of course, has gone kind of a very different path with kind of extreme drawing on internal resources at tremendous, tremendous human cost in the 1950s and well into the 1960s, and then a quite sharp turn toward markets in the late 1970s. They're an interesting case for a historian of development because their development was mostly internal. There are some World Bank loans and so on, but really it was generated by internal resources, not by external resources.
Yeah. So, as India grapples with these issues of development strategy, poverty, inequality, what are the most important lessons from the experiences of these apostles that you think our policy could draw from? I mean, you have this very sad thing that you say. It's sad because, you know, the apostles' successors have drawn their own lessons from the challenges but have moved further and further away from the grand vision of the 1950s, working on small-scale projects and favoring NGOs as vehicles of development. The apostles' successors have worked with equal intelligence and effort, but towards smaller goals. The price of the apostles' hard-won experience then is a modesty unbecoming of the enormity of the problems of poverty and inequality that still plague the world. Elaborate.
Sounds like a Cambridge test question,
It does,
exam
yes.
question, in fact. What I mean by that is some of that's specific to development economics, which has turned into this remarkably vibrant field that what they would call the causal revolution. They were able to use statistical procedures and research that allows really quite specific and precise sense of what causes what. Historians are very...
Ceteris paribus.
Economists aren't always so strong on this. And this amounts to what they would call natural experiments or randomized control trials. And they've been brilliantly successful at a causal level. And yet they really only operate at the level of... they operate most effectively, I should say, at the level of the village or the urban neighborhood. You can have two villages, one of which gets bed nets and one doesn't. But you can't run Bangladesh 1 and Bangladesh 2 with different macroeconomic policies. And so I think what I see in there is lots of efforts to deal with at small scale and with really remarkable insight, but no longer looking to government policy, no longer looking at the big picture in quite the same way. Jagdish Bhagwati actually gave a commencement address in the early 2000s in which he said, you know, it's great to have an NGO, but really policy is the name of the game. And I would say it's a both and. I guess I'm generally in a both and category. But that NGOs and the sort of small scale interventions will not be sufficient to reckon with the problem. Policies need to be aligned properly as well. So that's one big takeaway. I also say another one is try not to get caught up in ideology. And we talked earlier about the market versus, state versus market, which I think was really evident at Cambridge as well in the 1950s when they were there. And they believed it an ideological matter of highest import. But instead look toward incremental change, practical solutions, et cetera, which is how I think Dr. Singh's prime ministership is a suitable endpoint for the project, for the book.
Yeah, no, that's like, it's very nice about how you describe the convergence that he attempts and gets endorsed by his colleagues and Amartya Sen and Professor Sen as well. My final question is, while you did say that, you know, it isn't as if these were unformed kind of bright people who turned up from some colonized places and came and learnt everything at Cambridge. But I think Cambridge serves as a metaphor for what the university should be doing best, sort of accommodating bright minds and allowing them to kind of grow and fostering that kind of an environment. Is the essence of a university fundamentally under attack at a time like this when Harvard's under attack? So of course this other slow attack that has been going on is underfunding universities, which even bigger universities have been undergoing. But now this whole idea of seeing the university as an elite space, we have a version of that in India as JNU is attacked, as other central universities which have really contributed immensely have. But this whole business that intellectual pursuit is described as an elitist idea, and therefore you go about destroying it. So what does it look like to you in terms of just what is lost as universities are attacked in this day and age?
I mean, it's a very personal question to me. I could not have written this book but for the Indian graduate students who I was working with and other international students. Could not have written this book without engaging with the international scholars as my colleagues. So I think one of the losses is this sort of cosmopolitanism that 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 really makes the American universities, and well, all major universities, not just in the United States, really is a tremendous offering. While of course what's going on at Harvard is particular and existential, and by extension existential for Yale, even though we've yet to be targeted, fingers crossed. But I think there's been you allude to this, a kind of steady decline of support, both political and economic support for universities, and that would be in flagship universities like the University of California at Berkeley and University of Wisconsin at Madison, but also at the universities that enroll mostly local populations, California State University at Northridge, dozens, hundreds of universities across the United States. So I think that this is obviously an existential crisis, but it's not the only crisis that universities are facing, and nor is it just an American problem. We've watched the underfunding of British universities, as well as, especially in certain moments, this kind of political threat to British universities. Universities in continental Europe are facing similar versions of scaling down. In some cases, like as in the Netherlands, actually trying to reduce the number of international students, et cetera. So some of this, I think, is that we're living in an era of a kind of politics of resentment that is stoked by political leadership.
And which way do you see it kind of going with your historian lens?
Well, historians like to revel in the past. We're always uncertain about the future.
Let's hope this becomes a past pretty soon.
Yes, I don't think it will. I think some of the changes, even under a friendlier political administration, will be very difficult to reverse. I think it will be hard for American higher education in general to regain the trust of brilliant scholars and brilliant students who want to come to the United States to study, and I think more Indians come to the U.S. As students than from any other country, and it's hard for me to see how that gets solved quickly. If one election could then reverse,
So it's not exactly an election cycle issue.
It's not just an election cycle issue. I fear that these are issues that will be to some degree, a permanent change, even after the kind of moment of resentment, political expression of resentment passes. I wish I could be more optimistic.
Yeah, that's a very sobering note to kind of end this discussion on, but I must thank you for bringing to us a different time when a university offered space and students were willing, and they turned into apostles of development, 6 economists in the world they made. That's Professor David C Engerman's book. Thank you so much for making time for us and for writing this.
Thank you.